Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another installment of Beards and Cars. This is a podcast layout series. As you can see from the time code below, it's a pretty long video, as these all are, and that's the whole point of the series. We can get into the juicier, more conversational style aspects of a particular topic or multiple topics, and of course have a two-way conversation down in the comments with you guys as well. Now, if you are new to this series, you can check in the description for all of the topics and the standout time codes so that you can jump around in the video if you want to different points. But for this particular pick, this is another community-suggested video, or video topic in particular, and it's a very interesting one. It's a little bit more of a meta topic. It's not like top 5 best this, or top 10 worst that, or predictions, or DLC. It's actually much more broader than that in its scope. In some ways, it's kind of more similar to the videos that I did about my thoughts on games like Gran Turismo Sport, or my 6-month review of that game, stuff like that. And the topic, as you saw from the video title, from the thumbnail, is where are racing games, or games in general, but specifically racing games, headed? Where is the culture of racing headed? What's the community's vibe? How has it changed already? How do I think it will change? How do you guys think it will change? So to get straight into that, I think some of the biggest highlights of the current scene of racing are, for one thing, that I believe it was last week I alluded to, racing games are becoming much more, or the racing game community, I should say, are becoming much more open to the concept of full-on sim games. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say for maybe a younger gamer. Maybe you grew up with GT Sport, Forza 7, Project Cars, AC. So if you have grown up and these are like the staples of your racing diet, then of course that will seem normal. But for those of us who are, say, like myself, in the mid-20s, people who are a little bit younger, certainly a little bit older, say late 20s, early 30s, or even above that if you've been gaming for longer in the racing world, doubtless you've seen these phases, in effect, that the racing scene has gone through. Because, of course, way back in, say, the 80s, you could go even earlier, I think, but the 80s at least, the 90s for the most part as well, until you got to, like, the PlayStation 1, in effect, racing games were by far more arcadish than they were trying to be simulations. You had the occasional ones like certain IndyCar games or Formula games where they did try to be as realistic as possible, but those were a little bit fewer. Most of them tended to go more for the fun side of things. And in some ways, there are still games like that. Stuff like the Crazy Taxi games, Need for Speed, Outrun Coast to Coast, those kind of just pure, or even stuff like Burnout as well, or Ridge Racer, pure old school arcade stuff. And that still caters to that particular audience. That was kind of the dominant phase of the time, or at least from what I've seen, and of course I could be wrong, but from what I've seen. Then as far as the later 90s, you had stuff like Gran Turismo burst onto the scene, you had Need for Speed games rising up, you had Test Drive Unlimited, or not Test Drive Unlimited, the Test Drive games preceding TDU coming out, and more of this, you could say, community of having a ton of cars in a game. That became more of an accepted thing, because again, games back in the day, for fairly obvious, say, hardware restrictions, couldn't be anywhere near as big. So then in the 90s, when you had more powerful consoles, the PlayStation, later on as well, the Xbox, they started to allow developers to have more content. And of course, Gran Turismo 1 was revolutionary. Gran Turismo 2, I would say, was even better. I know that's controversial. Some people prefer the first one. And of course, the first one is the first for a reason. The second one, though, was the first one for me. That was the first Gran Turismo game I played. Then after that, I think you could say that from around, say, 1997 up until maybe around 2010, possibly, maybe a little bit later, but I would say around 2010, so a good decade or just over in effect, games became much more about having lots of cars, lots of tracks. That became the cool thing to do, because you had Gran Turismo 2, then 3, then of course 4, which is pretty much the overwhelmingly brilliant example from that mid-2000s era of what a game could be for the time. You had stuff like Test Drive Unlimited, the TOCA Race Driver series, the outstanding WRC games, the Colin McRae Rally games which started to have more cars, more tracks, better graphics. And that was like the big thing. Every game was boasting about how many cars they had. But in a funny kind of way, we've almost moved past that now, because now we're not in an era where games have 1,000 cars. That just doesn't really happen now. You've got Forza 7, which is leading the market in effect with around 700 cars or so, which is kind of ironic because that's what Gran Turismo 4 had well over a decade ago. But you've got Gran Turismo Sport, which has far less. It's due to have around 500 by the end of its run, whereas at the moment it's nowhere near that. It's more like, I think, 200 and something, like 230, 240, something like that. Then you've got Assetto Corsa, Project Cars. I'm not sure exactly how many cars they have, but I don't think it's as many as Forza and Gran Turismo. I think it might be similar to GT Sport, like 300 or so, something like that. But again, I could be wrong, I don't play them. Then you've got other stuff which came along like Test Drive 2. You've got the Need for Speed games, as I mentioned earlier, which cater more to the arcade side of things. But even then, the Need for Speed games got bigger. You had more cars, more tracks. The Midnight Club games got bigger and bigger. The, say, enthusiasts of the scene, which kind of came and went. But again, similar kind of thing. Tons of cars, tons of tracks, really in-depth tuning. That was the era. Really, that was kind of the dominant thing for the 2000s, and yet since 2010, sim racing has become more of a cool thing. And I don't mean that it wasn't cool before, of course not. It hasn't really changed. A sim has always been a sim. It's just got better over the years in terms of how powerful the game can be, how good it can look, etc., the kind of console that you play it on. But it's become more socially acceptable to love a sim. It's almost like the way that movies would portray a nerd, for instance, in the 80s, compared to how a nerd is portrayed now. In the 80s, of course, the nerd would be pushed around. He'd have the thick bottle cap glasses, a dumb backpack that was barely hanging on with maths books hanging out of it. That's not a nerd anymore. A nerd these days is like Andrew Garfield playing Spider-Man. That's like a nerd now. It's more like a hipster, in effect. As I was, again, talking about last week, it's more like the difference between nerd and geek. So again, cultures change, and of course that's going to affect the racing world. So nowadays, more so than I would say ever before, sims have come into the mainstream culture. Whereas, say in the 90s, the early 2000s, sim games were much more specialised. They had smaller, more dedicated pockets of fans. I know some of you guys love your sim games on like the PC, that kind of stuff, be it Formula games, NASCAR games, whatever the case may be. These ultra-realistic, very unforgiving approaches where if you make a mistake, it feels like a real mistake. You have to pay to run cars, run teams, fuel, damage, all that kind of stuff. You could say complete authentic experience, at least as far as the console or the PC can take it. That is interesting. It's interesting to see how the amount of cars and the amount of tracks has almost become less of an important thing in the eyes of the developers, at least, and being more realistic has almost become more important, again, to the developers. And that's the funny thing, because, and this doesn't just apply to the racing world, but gaming in general as a culture is definitely changing. And it's partially because, of course, the gaming culture has to, at the same time as creating a culture, it has to cater to that culture as well. It's kind of a weird circular process where developers cater to people who dictate what they want, but at the same time the developers tell people what they want. So, as I said, it's kind of this weird circular thing where if you would have asked someone, do you want loot boxes in games, most people would say no. And yet the developers almost created that problem, and then people started to accept it because it was there. And then people complain about it, some people make use of it. Wherever you stand, that's almost just the way it is now. That's part of culture, not just for racing games, but all games. So of course, stuff like loot boxes, the whole pay to win instead of play to win, which personally I hate. But I don't hate the people who do it. I hate that you can do it. I hate that it's become an option, because it's just so, I don't know, it seems so pointless to do that. I mean, what's the point of playing if you're just going to try and pay your way to the victory? I mean, in a sense, it's kind of ironic, because in the business world, that's actually not a bad tactic, because a lot of successful people do kind of do that. So people who do pay to win aren't necessarily doing something wrong as far as life choices go. They're probably going to do pretty well as far as making money. But those of us who actually want to play a game just to have fun, well, most of us probably despise the idea of loot boxes. Now, as I think I mentioned before, I bought, for instance, the collector's editions of Gran Turismo Sport and Forza 7. So as part of that bundle, in Forza 7 in particular, I had the loot boxes available. Not all of them, but a number of them. I personally found them to be kind of irrelevant, because the stuff that I won from the boxes was mediocre at best. So that just sealed the deal for me that I never had any interest in pursuing loot boxes or anything like that again. I've always hated the idea of paying real money for fake credits, and there is pretty much only one scenario where I am willing to pay more into a game after I've already bought it, and that is DLC. But even then, I will only do it sometimes. Now, back in the day, for instance, on Test Drive Unlimited 1 especially, I would buy everything. All of the DLC on that game. And again, it's because of the age that I was. Also, I was like 13, 14, whatever. So I wanted those cars, so I bought them. I don't regret that at all, because I loved all of them. All of the packs were worth it. And I hate the fact that I can't access them anymore. Whereas now, I literally buy no car packs on Forza games anymore, because on Horizon 3, I've got all the DLC that I wanted. There are complete packs that I haven't bought and I don't plan to. On Forza 7, I'm the VIP, collector's edition anyway, so I don't have to buy any, at least for the moment. I've pre-ordered Horizon 4, so although I've paid more for the version that I bought, because again, I just went for the collector's one, the Ultimate or whatever it's called, I don't have to pay for the car packs, and ultimately it works out to be cheaper. Not by a massive amount, but it's cheaper nonetheless, it's simpler, blah blah blah. So there are circumstances where I will pay for extra stuff, but usually I will only do that if it's, well, of course, justifiable to me. And those kind of things that I will buy are not things that give me some kind of advantage, it's just additional fun in the game, like extra cars, or in the case, for instance, of something like Fallout 4. Fallout 4 is one of my favourite games. I would easily put it up there with Forza and Gran Turismo, in fact, and I did buy the download packs in that game. But the difference with something like Fallout is when you buy a DLC pack on that game, you really do get your money's worth, because they are huge. It's like a completely new game. That, to me, is worth it. And if I knew for a fact that, for instance, a part of the game that I paid for was not developed from day one. See, this is the thing that I don't like. If I buy a game for, say, £50, and then right from day one you can download a DLC pack for an extra £10, but if what that DLC pack gives me is available from day one, then that annoys me, because that means it should have been in the game already. That I do not like. And unfortunately, that is what happens most of the time. Even the car packs, they tend to be cars that should have been available from day one. On other occasions, I think it is a justifiable thing. But the problem is, of course, it's difficult to know when that is the case, because they don't give us that information. Now, to give an example of when I think that is appropriate, if I was going to develop my own racing game, which I would love to do, I'd love to make a massive game on, say, the PlayStation 4, for instance, maybe PS5 by the time, something like that would be possible. But let's just say PS4 for the sake of it. I would love to make a racing game that's on a PS4, but is in effect Gran Turismo 2. So, like, deliberately PS1 graphics, but using a PS4 to power it. So you've essentially got this game which is on a console that's far more powerful than it needs to be. So you've got no loading screens, or basically no loading screens like Tony Hawk American Wasteland style. Tons of new cars, but with like PS1 90s era nostalgically bad graphics. And of course you have to be a certain age to appreciate that. A kid, for instance, today probably wouldn't, because they didn't grow up with that. Whereas for those of us in our 20s and 30s who actually do have the money to buy these kind of consoles and games at will, essentially, we would appreciate that, because that's what we grew up with. So I'd love to make something like that. And the reason why I bring that up is because I would actually use that, if I were the developer of that game, I would use that as a justifiable case of charging the people who buy my game for DLC. And what I mean by that is, I would create a game that is big enough to last you at least a year to complete career mode. So in effect, something the size of Gran Turismo 4. Then though, after say, maybe 6 months, I would use that time to develop a completely new portion of the game which was not ready at the time of release. So something that is genuinely new, and I didn't just hold it back to make more money. So in effect, I would make a racing game that never needed a sequel. It just kept getting bigger with DLC. And when I add the DLC, it would cost you maybe £20, but it would give you another year's worth of content. Massive additions to the game, like a, 15 or 20 gig download that gives you an entirely new aspect of career mode that wasn't there before, dozens of new cars, actually make it feel like it's worth it. Not just charging people for what should have been in the game from day one, but justifiably earning money because, in effect, you're giving people kind of a sequel, in effect, but it's still within the first game. So although they're paying £20 extra, that's still cheaper than buying a sequel. Because, a new game is, 40 or 50 quid. So in the long run, it's cheaper for the customer, but it's also better for me, because I don't have to develop a second game. I can just expand that first one. And the advantage of that is it rewards the loyalty of the players, because they don't have to buy a new thing. If they've been there from day one, they can experience the game getting bigger and better. So that's what I would do. So I think there are circumstances where DLC and expansion packs are justified. But I think most of them aren't, and that's the unfortunate thing. And again, unfortunately, that is the majority of modern culture. It's become a pay-to-win scenario, and that's such a shame, because in some ways, games are easily the best they've ever been, in terms of, the power that the consoles have, the kind of size that the games can be, the attention to detail. I mean, look at the graphics in GT Sport. The replays sometimes look real. It's only because it says Gran Turismo on the screen that you'd even know sometimes. Especially on a track, for instance, where you have real camera angles, like the Top Gear track, for instance. If it had that on there, they would doubtless use the real cameras, as, for instance, Forza did, or Gran Turismo did in the past. Or, for instance, in photo mode. Photo mode looks incredible now. It could not have looked like that on the PS2, for obvious reasons. So in some ways, I think current gaming culture and current games are fantastic. In others, it's almost like it's not the game itself that's bad. It's this additional business side of things, which we as the consumer do not care about, but that, again, I don't think it's even the developers. It's more like the producers of the game that force this stuff to be in there. Because that the guy in charge at, say, Turn 10, is it Dan Greenwalt, I think, or Kaz for Gran Turismo, those guys who are like the director of the game, regardless of your opinion of Forza, regardless of your opinion of Gran Turismo, you cannot honestly tell me that the first thing that those guys are thinking of is loot crates. It's not. Those guys are artists. They want to make great games. So, of course, that's not the first thing on their mind. It's those other people who get that kind of stuff in the game, the producers, the higher up people who have that kind of stuff in there to try and squeeze every last penny out of the consumer. It's almost like the Apple situation as well. Look at the iPhone 7. I literally today upgraded my phone to a new one. I got an iPhone 6S, and I refuse to go newer than that, because I have no interest in buying a phone which has one port for charging that you cannot put headphones into, because then you have to buy that stupid adapter to use headphones and a charger at the same time. And I know that, that's Apple's thing, you could buy a different company, but they all do it. It's all just in different ways. So, it's not just gaming culture. It's just culture in general, or at least Western culture, that's for sure, where you just pay for things that you didn't ask for, to upgrade things that shouldn't break in the first place. You have products that are designed to break early. And again, I've kind of discussed this stuff in my Tech Rant episode of this series a while back, but it's because it's so much of an issue, and it's still an issue. And unfortunately, that pervasive, disgusting aspect of business has inevitably seeped its way into the racing world as well, and as long as the consumers keep using it, they will keep doing it. You know, I can't remember what game it was, it might have been Battlefront or something like that. They had loot crates, and there was so much of an outcry that they removed it. I'm not sure if it was Battlefront or not, but some game like that, they flat out removed it because people hated that so much. Now, I believe they actually reinstalled it later, or reinstated it, but in some kind of slightly different form. But that goes to show the community and the consumer still has a powerful enough voice for change. The problem is that most of the time we don't use that voice. We just mindlessly go along with it, and that is so annoying to see. You know, even me, you could say, oh, why did you upgrade to another iPhone then? Well, because I think you can actually have a nuance. It's not a yes or no, 1 or 0 binary kind of question. You can have nuance within there. For instance, yes, I got a new iPhone, but I didn't get the one with the stupid single jack. So, again, it's not like this yes or no thing. You can kind of ride the wave, if you will, between the two and try and have some nuance to your opinions, to your choices. And of course, that's what everyone should have, really. Or, you know, that's one point of view at least. So I think that's current racing culture. As far as where it's going to go, well, that's difficult to say. Because if it goes the way it's already going, I don't think it looks good. Games will doubtless continue to look even better. Consoles will continue to be more powerful. And that's pretty much all that's guaranteed. As far as the rest, well, that's the stuff that I'm not looking forward to as much, because racing communities are simultaneously becoming more skilled, but also more toxic. The hate between communities is more vocal than it has ever been, thanks to YouTube, thanks to forums, thanks to all of these places where people bash on other franchises and on other games just because they feel, again, like they have to have a yes or no attitude, an either or. That's not the case. You can like Gran Turismo and Forza. You can like Marvel and DC. People who tell you otherwise are small-minded, quite frankly. So the way that culture is going is not a place that I'm looking forward to, as far as racing game goes, or as far as racing games go. And I think that somebody really needs to come along and make something new. Not necessarily a new console, but like a new game. Something with a new spin. And to some degree, that is what Project Cars and Assetto Corsa did. And good on them, regardless of my opinions of those games. You know, I'm not an AC fan. Project Cars, I can see why people like it, but I haven't played it that much. But good for them for making it work. They have those communities, they have those fans, and they appear, at least from what I've seen, to be treating those fans well. Of course, you can always complain about something, but for the most part, I'm hearing good things about those franchises. That is great to know, because I don't need to love them. As long as somebody does, that's good. So, yeah, those are my thoughts, I think, overall about the current culture of racing. There are some great things, there are some downright dumb things, like loot crates, for instance. I know that some people get extremely angry about them. I wouldn't necessarily go that far. You know, I've got better things to be angry about than loot crates. But as far as I'm concerned, it's just one of those occasions where you don't need to be angry about it, just don't buy it. Literally nobody is forcing you to. What I do get angry about, for instance, is when you don't have the option. And that is where DLC begins and loot crates end in terms of blurring the line, because, as an example, I recently played Fallout 3. I played Fallout 3 after Fallout 4. I'd heard that so many people loved the game, so I thought, sure, why not play it? I played it ages ago, didn't like it, but I went back to it and actually got into it a lot more. Then I get to the end of the game, and without spoiling anything, when you finish the main story, you can't go back. You cannot complete the side missions without downloading a DLC for another £8. That makes me angry, because that is stupid. That is downright, as far as I'm concerned, fraudulent behaviour. To charge someone to be able to finish a game is so unethical, it's ridiculous that they even thought they could get away with that, and yet so many people seem to love the game. I do not get that mentality. For me, that ruined the entire game. Whereas the fourth game, I love it. There's nothing like that in the fourth game. So it's weird. Now, when they do that, that annoys me. Because that's not pay to win, that's pay to finish. And that is so ridiculous. That's borderline fraud, in fact, paying for something and then having to pay again to finish it when you're not told that you'd have to do that. That's ridiculous. But hey, that's my thoughts overall. Of course, it's a discussion which has a lot of nuance in it, so people have different opinions, that's for sure. Things that they do love about modern communities or culture in racing games, things that they don't like as much. And of course, for those of us who have come from maybe the 90s and the early 2000s scene, like myself, playing Gran Turismo 2 and Gran Turismo 3 and Need for Speed Underground, we'll have a different kind of attitude to, for instance, if your first racing game was GT Sport. That's such a different situation. So, of course, it comes with age as well. It's always going to be different from generation to generation also. So I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, of course, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.